Hello there, very warm welcome to this digital exclusive on News 18. We're in conversation today with a veteran diplomat, somebody who has been Canada's former ambassador to Afghanistan, spent a lot of time there, has very strong views about what's going on vis-a-vis the Taliban and the takeover by the Taliban of that country, and also, more importantly, how the West should be dealing with this particular development. So, Chris Alexander, thank you very much and welcome to this News 18 digital exclusive.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be with you.
All right, so let's start off with your assessment of how things have gone over the last, let's say, month or so since the fall of Kabul, the decision by the US to withdraw, and just how they've put in place a government where it seems like the dominant strain or the dominant faction seems to be controlled by Pakistan. What are your views on what you've seen over the last 4 weeks or so?
Well, it's been an unmitigated disaster that has gone from bad to worse. I think the whole world, including Afghans themselves, who are obviously the principal victims of this new wave of obscurantist violence and repression, are still in shock. And no one predicted, almost no one predicted the speed of the takeover. And very few, in fact, very many of those who had been involved in the negotiating process over the past several years in Doha and before that in other capitals, expected the Taliban to be as thuggish as they have turned out to be. I think many of us who've watched them over the longer term had few illusions on this score. But what we saw was a takeover in Kabul that transitioned quickly into a power struggle between different wings of the Taliban movement, different strands of the Taliban movement. And unsurprisingly, the ones that are closest to ISI, the ones that are closest to Pakistan, have enforced their supremacy on the others, which makes the regime even more repressive. Meanwhile, the international community, shocked by this turn of events, have been focusing very narrowly on getting people out, and a relatively tiny group of Afghans have been able to escape thanks to the United States and others, while 35 to 40 million remain in the country facing this terrible repression. There's starting to be a transition towards serious discussion of humanitarian needs because the economy is collapsing. Education is unfunded. People are literally falling into poverty in larger and larger numbers every day. And so basic needs have to be met. And in this drive to meet basic needs, there's a tendency in the humanitarian community, especially, to just want to take the Taliban as they are uncritically, to be nice to them. And unfortunately, that's paralyzing the political response, which ought to be much firmer, in my view.
So you said, this factional feud that's going on between the Haqqanis on the one side and the Doha Taliban, as it were, the folks who were engaged in negotiations with the West. Was this something that the West was not able to anticipate? The fierceness of these clashes, including the reports that we heard last week of Mullah Baradar storming out of a meeting, going off to Kandahar, and then there had to be videos of him put out saying that he's alive and well. This intense factionalism, you said it was unsurprising, but again, given what we've seen over the last month or so, it seemed like the West was again caught off guard by just how deep the divisions are.
Yes, I think those who have been involved in the peace process, inverted commas peace process, which has led to a perverse result, and other close observers of the Afghan scene were not surprised to learn that there are factions in the Taliban. They are surprised to find out yet again that the ultimate control, the ultimate supremacy in the movement lies with those who are closest to generals and other officers in Rawalpindi. And this is really the illusions of 10 years dying hard, because remember, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who had been fighting NATO forces, had been a very fierce commander in southern Afghanistan, had been one of the first to start to reach out to the United Nations, even when I was there, the United States and others, to say peace is possible, reconciliation is possible. And many thought that he was speaking and acting in good faith at that time, to the point that, as you will recall, later in 2010, after he had made these contacts, he was picked up and locked up by ISI for 8 long years. So he has a certain track record on this front, and then almost certainly a chip on his shoulder with regard to the way he was treated by Pakistan. So I think there are many, Khalilzad and others sitting in Doha, who were counting on Baradar to be the moderate voice, to be the one that was skeptical about Pakistani control and so forth. But he's been sidelined, as so many other moderates in these terrorist groups have been sidelined in the past. It's a pattern that we've seen repeated over decades, and no one who's a real student of the region should be surprised.
One of the other things which the West always knew all along for the last 20 years, I wouldn't even call it a long rope. What do you call a long rope over a period of 2 decades? That the fulcrum or the levers of power, the puppet strings, as it were, of controlling the Taliban were always in Pakistan. It was across the Durand Line, it was in Rawalpindi. And this is, again, not a secret to the White House, successive White Houses, may I say, or to Canada or UK or any other Western country that was involved in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. And yet, somehow, when the events of the last 3 or 4 weeks played out, the West still hasn't confronted Pakistan with the kind of overt and covert support that they have been giving to the Taliban all these years. I think, this week, Imran Khan is going to be in America. And I'm pretty sure that, many Western leaders will continue to engage with him, continue to believe that, they are the last country standing before this evil force called the Taliban takes over. Why do they continue to still give Pakistan such a long rope? Why do they still continue to believe that Pakistan is actually a force for good in this region and in this particular context, when evidence has been to the contrary for the last 20 years?
The evidence has been to the contrary, but the story hasn't been fully told to American and European audiences or international audiences. I think the bottom line is as simple as that. Let's be clear about Pakistan's role here. It was a de facto ally of the United States in the Cold War, declared as such by Eisenhower even before. And then when Kissinger and Nixon made their opening to China in 1971, that relationship was reaffirmed and deepened as Pakistan became the conduit for this strategic turn that, in the views of many Americans, not just Republicans, Democrats as well, ended the Cold War because of U.S. de facto cooperation with China, and then later the fight against the Soviets in the 1970s. So Pakistan thinks that they have a limitless, bottomless reservoir of goodwill in Washington. But in fact, over the last 20 years, they've been drawing it down very, very quickly. And I think it's increasingly clear to Americans and everyone else that this duplicity has been happening on a scale that is almost unparalleled in history. And so there are reckonings ahead. I mean, I think, and many agree, that Biden made a terrible mistake by embracing the Trump deal with the Taliban and allowing the fall of Kabul and the return of the Taliban to happen as quickly as it did. But he has not enunciated a policy with regard to Pakistan. I'm not sure what future visits may yield, but I doubt it will be business as usual. I doubt it will be a clean bill of health. I think the whole international community is revisiting its view of Pakistan. And it's going to be very, very hard to avoid the conclusion that this state, particularly its military, is a state sponsor of terror. And if we are standing up to interference and invasion in countries like Ukraine by Russia, standing up to genocide by China in eastern Turkestan, Xinjiang, as they call the province, then there really can't be, we can't look the other way with regard to this systematic pattern of interference Pakistan has been pursuing in Afghanistan, not just for 20 years, but for 50 years, ever since it chose strategic depth as its core doctrine in the early 1970s after the loss of East Pakistan, Bangladesh.
All right. Since you mentioned China, and there is a view that perhaps an unintended consequence of America and this drastic withdrawal, this completely botched up withdrawal from Afghanistan, one of the unintended consequences, and perhaps a happy fallout of that, is that America now can focus squarely on where it believes its current and future threats are going to come from, and that is squarely from China. So AUKUS, which was announced last week, Australia, UK, and the US, this new alliance, this military alliance. Do you see, America taking its eyes off Afghanistan and this region, allowing it to focus more resources, to focus more energies, time, money into where the real threat is, and that is from China? How do you think AUKUS will play out in the near future? I mean, especially when you're talking about nuclear-powered submarines, that's really changing the game, or at least the game as it exists now.
Yes, I think that is an important development, one that does point to bipartisan consensus in the United States that is continuing from the Trump era, began even before the Trump era, through the Biden administration, placing China at the center of the strategic focus of the United States, and reinvigorating this alliance building that really stopped under Trump, and is now reaching new heights, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, through the Quad, and now this submarine announcement with Australia and the UK. That said, I don't see how allowing a democracy, very imperfect, but still functioning democracy that empowered women, that brought an unprecedented new level of education to a very young population in Afghanistan, in the center of Asia, in the heart of Asia, how letting that democracy fail and a really despotic regime take over plays into an agenda of containing China or even countering Chinese influence. There is a school of thought, quite a cynical one, I think, in the Obama administration and now repeating in the Biden administration, that says, if Russia wants to prop up Syria, Assad in Syria, we'll let him do that. We'll be giving him, more than enough rope to hang himself. He can't afford it anyway. That there's some in the Biden administration who will be saying the same about Afghanistan. We could not afford this. We could not change Pakistan's behavior. So let them fill their boots with it. Let China be the source of subsidies and investment for Afghanistan. It's going to be a two-edged sword for them, because terrorism in East Turkestan is a problem for China too, and that will weaken China. Well, unfortunately, that kind of zero-sum thinking comes at the expense of the Afghan people and of the whole idea of democracy and moderation and free media in Central Asia. So I think the costs far outweigh any benefits, and that's the kind of thinking we expected from Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s. I don't think it has any place today, when we really should be trying to support democracy, free societies, free expression wherever we can on the planet today. And the running cost, as it were, of keeping the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan and keeping schools open and the country and democracy functioning was relatively low. The costs of this disaster have yet to be counted, but they're going to be very high, no matter how you you care to forecast the future.
All right, Chris Alexander, thank you so much for speaking with us here on this News 18 News Stream exclusive. Thank you very much for your insights and your time.
Thanks for having me.